Hello, first of all, I want to say Merry Christmas. I hope you're all having a great holiday, and I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Now, this was published in 1843, and since this book was published, this story has gone on to become arguably one of the most famous stories of all time, and even people who have never read the book instantly recognize the name Ebenezer Scrooge. Like, the name Ebenezer Scrooge has really become so ingrained into not just literature, but in Western culture in general. Like, whenever there's somebody who's being an asshole, especially around the holidays, usually he's called a Scrooge. Like, the name Scrooge really, once again, it's a name that everybody recognizes, even people who have never read this book or might not even know that that name originated from this book. And this story was written 173 years ago now, but it's a story that really has stood the test of time, and not just is the main character, Ebenezer Scrooge, so recognizable to Western culture, but so are a lot of the characters in this book, like Jacob Marley and Tiny Tim. Like, almost all the characters in this book have become so iconic, and the story in general has become so ingrained into Western culture. And to me, there's a reason this story is still read and still talked about even today. There's a reason this story has been so endearing for all these years. That's because it really is a great story of redemption, and it's also a really good Christmas story in general, and the story itself, to me, really does kind of capture the spirit of what Christmas is supposed to be all about. Now, growing up, I've always been a huge fan of this story. Now, I've read this book before, and I recently reread it, but I only read this book for the first time a couple of years ago. But even before I read this book, I've always been familiar with this story because I've seen many of the different film adaptations of this book, and I remember when I was in school, like, when I was in elementary school, like, my school would take us to, like, plays of this book and stuff like that, so I've always been familiar with the story of A Christmas Carol, and once again, it's a story that I've always loved, and only a few years ago did I actually read the book, and I do love the book, and to me that really is the sign of a story that has truly stood the test of time, when you don't even have to read the book and you already know the story almost by heart. I mean, I still recommend reading the book because it is a great book, and even though it's a story that everybody knows, I still recommend reading it because it's always good to know where things started and where the roots of a certain story began. Now, the plot of A Christmas Carol is, it's set, of course, around Christmas time, and it's about this old man named Ebenezer Scrooge, who, in the beginning of the story, is pretty much just this angry curmudgeon. Like, he's this very angry, bitter old man, and he's a businessman, but it turns out that he cares more about business and more about money than he does his fellow human beings, and he also treats people in his life like complete shit. Like, he treats his employee like complete shit, he treats his nephew like shit, and he's really kind of pushed a lot of people that he knows out of his life, and once again, he's just this angry, bitter old man, but you do find out in the story that there is a reason he's as angry and bitter as he is now. Now, in the story, you find out that 7 years before the events of this book, Scrooge's friend, Jacob Marley, died, and Jacob Marley was very similar to Scrooge in the sense that he was a very angry, bitter person, and he also kind of cared more about business rather than people, and because of this, Marley's soul has pretty much been condemned to hell, but one night Scrooge gets visited by the ghost of Jacob Marley, and Jacob Jacob Marley warns Scrooge that if he doesn't change his ways, he's doomed to the same fate that Jacob Marley's suffering from now. And Marley warns Scrooge that he will be visited by 3 spirits, and these 3 spirits come to Scrooge in the form of the ghost of Christmas past, the ghost of Christmas present, and the ghost of Christmas yet to come. So the first ghost, of course, takes Scrooge back in time, and then you as the reader see what drove Scrooge to become such an angry person as an old man. Like, you see him as a child, and you see him as a young man, and you find out that he really didn't have a very happy childhood, and you see these events in his life that kind of led him to becoming this angry, bitter person. And then the second ghost shows Scrooge the present and shows Scrooge the lives of all these people that he knows, and basically shows him what other people really think of him. And then the final ghost takes Scrooge into the possible future, and then that ghost shows Scrooge the consequences of what Scrooge does, and the ultimate consequences of what could happen if Scrooge does not change his ways. Now, once again, I've always loved A Christmas Carol, both the book and the story in general. Just the story for this book has always kind of resonated with me, and I really can't put my finger on why. Just for some reason, this story, ever since I was a little kid, has always kind of resonated with me. And to me, it's not just a great Christmas story, but it's also a great story of redemption, because you see this guy who, the book gives you every reason in the world to hate this guy, but the book shows you that there's a reason this guy is the way he is, and it shows you him start to become a better person when he realizes the consequences of not just what will happen to him if he continues on this path, but he also realizes the consequences of what will happen to other people if he continues the way he's going. And this really is a deeply moving story, and one of the things I found so moving about it is what I think is the thing that really does drive Scrooge to become a better person is when he sees into the life of Bob Cratchit, who is his employee, and Bob is very poor, like his whole family is poor, and Bob has a son named Tiny Tim, who you realize in the story is actually dying, and Scrooge sees this, and I really feel like this is the thing that really does start to truly drive Scrooge to try to become a better person. And in this book, there actually is quite a bit of social commentary on things like poverty and greed, and the idea of money corrupting a person, and the whole idea of money not really being able to truly buy happiness. For example, Scrooge, for the most part, is pretty well off, yet he's still just a miserable human being. But then you see Bob Cratchit, who, while his family is pretty much dirt poor, they're still happy with each other. And I feel like what Charles Dickens is trying to say with that is that really money can't buy true happiness. What creates true happiness is friends and family and people in your life. So yeah, this book has a lot of social commentary in it, and it very much is kind of a social critique, and a lot of the book, once again, deals with poverty, and it's really kind of about how the system kind of breaks people down, and you really do get the idea that one of the things that might have driven Scrooge to become the way he is now is really the system, and the way the system is kind of set up, because Scrooge kind of was born in poor upbringings, so he kind of drove himself to become as good of a businessman as he can be, but along the way, he kind of lost his true humanity and lost sight of what it truly means to be a human being, and he kind of started to care more about business and more about money rather than other human beings. And you really do see a critique on capitalism, not just in this book, but in a lot of Charles Dickens books, especially Oliver Twist. But once again, A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens is a fantastic story, and I cannot recommend this book enough, and chances are you probably already know the story, but you might not have read the book, so definitely give the book a read. It's definitely worth it. Now, there have been countless different adaptations of this book. There were various different plays made based on this book. There have also been many different film adaptations of this book. The earliest known adaptation of this book actually came out in 1901, and it was called Scrooge or Marley's Ghost. And once again, that is the earliest known adaptation. Now, there were a few other adaptations of this story after that, but they were all short films, but the first feature-length adaptation of this book was a film called The Right to Be Happy, which came out in 1916. And after that, there have been multiple different adaptations of this book. Now, growing up, one of my favorite adaptations of this book was this animated version of the story, which came out in, like, I want to say 1997 or 1998, which actually had Tim Curry voicing Ebenezer Scrooge. And I always used to love that one when I was a little kid. There has also been Mickey's A Christmas Carol. There has been The Muppets Christmas Carol. There's also a version of A Christmas Carol with Patrick Stewart as Ebenezer Scrooge. There's also a film from Robert Zemeckis, which came out in 2009, that had Jim Carrey as Ebenezer Scrooge, and I think that one was one of those, like, all CGI movies. Rod Serling even did an adaptation of A Christmas Carol in 1964 with a movie called A Carol for Another Christmas, and this was kind of a Cold War take on A Christmas Carol. There have also been many different parodies on this story, like you had the film Scrooged with Bill Murray, and there was also a 2004 made-for-TV film called Carol's Christmas, which was kind of a parody on this story as well. So yeah, that was my review on A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, and bye.